Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Before I Go podcast. Today, I wanted to talk to you briefly about the idea of vulnerability. Full disclosure, it took me a while to actually sit down and write the script for this episode because vulnerability is still something that I sometimes struggle with. I had to ask myself, but why though? Well, let's take a look at the actual definition of vulnerability. Vulnerability is the willingness to show emotion or to allow one's weakness to be seen or known. The willingness to risk being hurt or attacked. Is that not one of the scariest things you've ever heard? No wonder so many people are reluctant to be vulnerable. Now, besides it just sounding scary, I know that there are other roadblocks to being vulnerable, and they are all, quite frankly, rooted in fear. There's the actual fear of being hurt or attacked. There's the fear of being perceived as weak. And the one that I think I most closely identify with is the fear that if I show you who I really am, then you'll reject me. Being vulnerable is not easy, and I will never pretend that it is. Like I said, I still struggle with it. I mean, you have to trust that the person or people that you're being vulnerable with won't use your vulnerability against you. That takes wisdom and discernment. Not everyone deserves your vulnerability. Just like not everyone deserves your heart. Be choosy. I believe that when you identify those people who you can trust not to hurt you, and you are vulnerable with them, you will find that the relationship grows deeper and much more meaningful. I discovered a major roadblock to vulnerability for me was actually my inability to be vulnerable with myself. Can you imagine? It wasn't until I learned a mindfulness process from psychologist and author Tara Brach that I was able to be vulnerable with myself and ultimately be vulnerable with others. The process is called RAIN, R-A-I-N. It's a 4-step process which stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. Employing this process was pretty easy, and it just took a willingness to be still for a few moments, trust yourself, and just think. It's amazing to me how many people are reluctant to sit with their own thoughts. Do you often sometimes walk into your house and you have to turn on the TV or you have to turn on the radio, you have to turn on something so there's background noise. You just cannot stand the silence. Well, in order for you to employ this process of RAIN, you really need some silence and you really need to be comfortable with that silence. So whenever I'm feeling some kind of way, I would stop and I would recognize what it was that I was feeling and I would give it a name. Then I would simply allow myself to feel those feelings. I gave myself permission to feel whatever it was that I was feeling, and I validated my feelings without berating myself or judging myself. Then I would investigate where those feelings were coming from. And then finally, I would nurture myself. I'd be kind to myself. You know, we are often our own worst critics, and we have to learn to be the first ones to not to criticize ourselves, but to nurture ourselves. Here's a quick story of RAIN in action. True story. So last year, I ended my relationship with my partner. It was in August of 2019. And even though we had broken up, he would drop me a text message every once in a while, just to keep his foot in the door, or at least that's what I think it was. Sometimes I would respond, but most times I would ignore him because when I'm done, I'm done. Now, after a few months, I found myself sitting in my living room alone, as I often do, because, quite frankly, I love my solitude. I enjoy my alone time. But this particular time, this overwhelming feeling washed over me. It was crazy. So I stopped and I thought for a moment. And I recognized that I was feeling lonely. I wasn't just feeling lonely, I was actually missing my man. Then, instead of pushing those feelings to the side or trying to deny that they existed. I allowed myself to feel exactly what I was feeling. Then I went a little further and I investigated the source. The fact is, he is a good man, and even though I felt I was justified in my decision, it could have been worked out. Finally, I had to nurture myself. I didn't beat myself up over the breakup or for feeling lonely. I just reminded myself that I'm human and that humans make mistakes. Then I did something that I never thought I would do. Now, don't get excited. I wasn't strong enough to call him and risk being rejected. I'm not to that point yet. But what I did do was pray. I told God that if he would allow my man to reach out to me one more time, then I would take him back. After that prayer, I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a text message from my man inviting me to church to come to hear him preach. I text back and told him that I would come because that's what I told the Lord. I was being obedient. He reached out one last time and I took him back, and we've been back together ever since. And once I learned to be vulnerable with myself, being vulnerable with others became that much easier. And when I went back into the relationship, like I said, we got back together, but it's not the same relationship. I have the freedom to be open and to be honest and to be vulnerable, and the relationship is that much better because of it. Being vulnerable with him opened doors to a much more meaningful relationship. And it wasn't easy, and it was kind of painful at first, but I think that if you try it, you'll find that it is well worth it. Well worth it. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. But before I go, let me share this with you from Jane Austen. It isn't what we say or think that defines us, but what we do.